Hello again. This is going to be a review of the first like 5 or 6 chapters of the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit by E. Michael Jones. It's not going to be like debunking anything, but I will give some of my thoughts and like maybe a couple criticisms here and there. But it's more just like going over the like chapters, like a bit of an overview, especially the first half of the book, because it's more or less just like a history of Catholic Jewish relations from a traditional Catholic perspective. I don't obviously like necessarily agree with like all his theological claims or like some of his historical claims like you can like quibble about, but for the most part it's pretty accurate. It's just how he presents it. You could like see that he's coming from his perspective and his side, which is the traditional Catholic side. Yeah, I mean, I think overall it was a pretty good read. I enjoyed reading it. It's like 1,000 pages, and I'm just going off of like notes I had. It's been a while since I actually read it, but I'm just going off of notes. I think it's kind of interesting to frame it that the whole idea of the Jewish revolutionary spirit, it's certainly not like an ethnic like racial thing, which you'll see. He like points to a lot of people who are just like not even Jews religiously or ethnically, but who still kind of like have this, quote unquote Jewish revolutionary spirit because they draw on like the Old Testament or maybe are influenced by like Jewish writings and stuff, but not necessarily like are Jews themselves. So I think it's an interesting book and definitely like is a different like ideological view or paradigm than like like a Kevin McDonald or like a more straight up like white nationalist view of the topic. But anyway, we can just go right into it. So in the intro, he goes over his idea of logos, which is divine order, more or less, the definition, and that is like exemplified by Christianity, like by Jesus and the like Greek rationalism and Old Testament prophecy and scripture combining into like the New Testament, Christianity, Catholicism, etc. That might not be like the best way to define it, but essentially his view is that Jesus came and was like logos incarnate, like from that scripture in John, and that Jews, if they reject Jesus, they are anti-logos, and that's what causes the whole Jewish revolutionary spirit. And then the Jews who did accept Jesus like just became the Christian church, which again is kind of one of those things where he doesn't like really have this ethnic view of it, at least not in the same way as like a lot of other people do. He definitely sees like rabbinic Judaism as like trying to like preserve ethnic Judaism, and that like that's kind of what the religion's turned into. But as a Christian, he believes that the new covenant came in and kind of like abolished like the difference between Jew and Gentile, and it's all just about faith and like being a spiritual Israelite and being a descendant of Abraham spiritually, more or less. He just briefly goes over that after like the temple is destroyed, Jews can no longer really practice Old Testament laws in the way that like they're supposed to. So that's kind of like the birth of rabbinic Judaism after the temple is destroyed. The Jews are dispersed, focus on like the Talmud and stuff over and the oral law over like Old Testament law. So moving into chapter 1, he just goes over again the history of the temple being destroyed, the Bar Kokhba revolt, dispersion. I want to point out that he relies a lot on Heinrich Graetz, who was a 19th century Jewish historian who like wrote one of the first big histories of the Jews. So he relies on him a lot. He just goes over kind of what I said before, that the Jews reject Jesus as the Messiah because Jesus did not come as like an earthly military commander who would like establish a kingdom on earth, like physical kingdom, and just like rule militarily. He was more of like a spiritual leader who believed in like a kingdom to come kind of thing. And that he, in his eyes, Jews to this day, and I think that is actually pretty accurate, that Jews to this day do believe in a Messiah type figure who's going to come, like religious Jews, who is more of like a military commander who will like physically bring peace on earth, stuff like that. It's kind of funny, like he even sees like certain like irreligious like secular things as like an outgrowth of that. Like he says like the Superman comics is like an unconscious way of like projecting what the like a Jewish Messiah into the culture. Like I guess because Eastern European Jews created a lot of superheroes and Superman was one of them. So in his view, Superman is like a Messiah type figure, which I mean, I don't know, I think that's kind of a stretch, but it's kind of funny. He does that a lot. He does like make kind of weird stretches to like modern phenomenon from past like religious views, but whatever, neither here nor there. And yeah, he like goes over the gospels somewhat in terms of like Jews from the gospel point of view, like have this pride in being like a racial ethnic DNA Jew, but Jesus in the gospels doesn't really care about that. It's just about like faith and like you could be a Jew, like physical descendant of Abraham, but not a spiritual descendant of Abraham, like Paul says. not all of Israel is Israel. It gets kind of confusing, and I mean the letters of Paul are like no easy task, but basically that's kind of the rub, is that there were Jews in the New Testament times who accepted Jesus, and then Jews who didn't, and the Jews who didn't were seen as like, you know, the synagogue of Satan types, whereas who persecuted the Jews who did follow Jesus. So in his view, the whole conflict with Jews in the New Testament period is, it's an inner conflict, or if that's the right word, like it's a conflict among the same like ethnic group of people. He also makes this funny, again, like he makes this stretch that like Nazism grew out of like Jewish emphasis on like DNA and race, like from the New Testament times. I mean, I don't know if he was like really trying to make that connection. He does say it's also a connection to modern Zionism, which is kind of true. I mean, Zionism is about like ethnic and religious Judaism, but I think the Nazism thing is kind of funny. Like obviously Nazis had other influences like social Darwinism and stuff like that, not like Old Testament or New Testament Jews, but whatever. And just a matter of curiosity, he does bring up Kevin McDonald and like does use McDonald a bit in terms of how to define like what a Jewish movement is. So that's kind of interesting that, I mean, you know, they obviously are aware of each other. And yeah, just goes over the revolt in 70 and the Bar Kokhba revolt, which, yeah, leads to the destruction of the temple and the dispersion of Jews. Chapter 2, I'm just going to go over pretty quickly, is about Julian the Apostate, who was the last pagan emperor of Rome. Julian, he tried to reestablish the temple, like rebuild it, because he knew that it would be kind of a blow to Christianity, and Julian wanted to like reignite paganism. There was kind of this anti-Christian notion among some people, especially like pagans, because it was more of a new religion in the sense that if its main figure was someone born like recently in their times, whereas like the pagan religions and Judaism had all these figures from like way far back in antiquity. Jesus was like a modern figure for them. It's like us thinking about George Washington or something. So anyway, Julian tried to rebuild the temple, and like obviously Jews were like promoted that and wanted that to happen, but it didn't end up happening. Anyway, from Jones's view, he believes that the temple was not rebuilt as like an act of God, that God prevented Julian from being able to build it, and he even says that he thinks Julian was like possessed. So obviously he's coming from like a traditional Catholic view, like not a secular historian. He also talks about John Chrysostom, who has like a lot of kind of like harsh words for Jews, and not only Jews, but the Judaizers, because during this time, like Christians and Jews kind of like mingle and have similar like overlap in terms of like places they go to worship, or just like, I mean, they rely on some of the same scripture, so there's going to be some overlap, and there's always, throughout the book you can see too that there's always this element of like Judaizing, like looking back to the Old Testament, and like using Old Testament ideas and Jewish ideas over like New Covenant, New Testament ideas. And John Chrysostom's like view on Jews and how Christian society should like respond to Jews is all part of a tradition in the Catholic Church with like Augustine, and later on a Catholic papal bull called Sicut Judaeus, if I'm pronouncing that right, which just kind of lays out the Catholic position on Jews, which is basically Jews should be protected as long as they're not disturbing the moral order. Like if they just do their own thing, then that's fine. But if they do anything out of bounds from like a religious Catholic political point of view, then they could be prosecuted or whatever. Moving on to chapter 3, he says after the failure to rebuild the temple, there's kind of like some hundreds of years where there's like relative quiet, like not a lot of Jewish revolutionary activity, as he would put it. But around the year 1000, there's a lot of millennialist activity, which millennialists thought, because it was the year 1000, that was like a big landmark, and it could point to like the end of times, or just point to like a major change in history. And apparently people were looking at the book of Daniel, which has the dream of Nebuchadnezzar with the statue with like the golden head and the copper feet, or whatever, I kind of forget, but I think you guys know what I'm talking about, like the prophecy of like the different ages of the earth, essentially, of history. And people look at this and like have their own ideas about like where they are in history and stuff. And so also during this time, like the Crusades are beginning to happen, and there are people like Peter the Hermit and a Count Amico, I think is how to pronounce it. And on their way to the Crusades, these figures kind of in like a fervor, like, or start attacking Jews, because I mean, why attack heretics in the Holy Land when you can just attack them at home? So Jews are like rounded up and killed in the German Rhineland area where a lot of like the Ashkenazi Jews originate from. And that during this time when the Jews were being attacked by, in Jones's word, Judaizing heretics, because it was these Judaizing people who saw like big changes in history and had this religious fervor, they were going out of the bounds of what the Catholic Church would like officially promote in terms of just like killing Jews. So the Jews would often go to the like bishop of the land and seek protection with him. So it kind of shows, and throughout the book, he talks about how higher ups in the Catholic Church who like knew more about church like tradition and rules, and weren't heretics in his eyes. Like, I mean, they weren't like buddy buddy with Jews, but they would protect them, and like they didn't think they should just be killed and stuff. But another thing that he adds is that like a lot of the reasons for this the attacks on Jews was because they were moneylenders, as like most people know. There's a whole history with that in terms of like them not really being allowed to join guilds and like or own land and stuff, which I think Jones doesn't really seem to bring up. But anyway, because the Catholic Church forbade Catholics from leasing money, Jews took that role and like practice usury, and then people would get pissed and like want to kill them. So to get out of that, sometimes the mob would go to the bishop's house or whatever where the Jews were at, and then they would either command like death for the Jews or baptism. And sometimes Jews would just like undergo baptism, and then generally that would like seal the deal. Like as long as they were baptized, and they were like left alone, and that was that. Even if it was like a forced baptism, because from the Catholic point of view, if you were baptized, like whether or not it's of free will or not, it doesn't really matter, especially if you consider like babies get baptized in the Catholic Church. It's not according to their will. It's just like a tradition. So when like a Jew like gets forced to be baptized, they're still technically have that mark of baptism, whether it was forced or not, under whatever circumstances. So they're considered a Catholic, and by Catholic law, like they're subject to that. So that's always like an issue in this history, and you'll see that later on with like the Spanish Inquisition and stuff. There's other theories about the end of days, like Joachim of Fiore has a 3-kingdom period, end of days type of thing, where like one period is the Father, one is the Son, one is the Spirit. I don't really need to get into it; it's not a big deal. But he says this was like has somewhat of a connection to like neocon end of history type of mentality, like in Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History. So again, like I think another stretch, but it's just whatever, that's his view. And so all of this religious fervor, because of the Crusades and the millennialist, feelings, the Dominicans and Franciscans rise up to counter heresy. And I mean, there are Jews, but they're also just like general heretics, and of course, Muslims in this time. And as Dominicans and Franciscans go about like reputing heresy, some Jews convert to Catholicism, and they start to like reveal that the Talmud is a thing, essentially. Because previously there was this view in the Catholic Church, like the Jews were just kind of closed off, and the Catholic Church just thought, oh, they just go with the Old Testament and don't have the New Testament, but they weren't super aware of what the Talmud was and like the oral law. But after knowing what the Talmud is, that leads to a lot of interesting debates and like book burnings and stuff down the line. So that's just kind of when that starts to happen in history. You see also at this time like accusations of blood libel, and like the plague begins to be a thing. So there are accusations that Jews like intentionally spread the plague and stuff and other things, but officially the Catholic Church would refute these things, and they saw it as just kind of like from the mob mentality of the masses. But the Catholic Church, like hierarchy, didn't really buy into these things, and would say like, oh well, I mean everyone got affected by the plague. It doesn't make any rational sense to think Jews caused it because they were just as affected. And anyway, he ends the chapter with saying that there are a lot of conversions. And if there's mixed with expulsions, it basically leads to the Ashkenazis going to Poland and the Sephardic going to the Netherlands and later in England. But he's also going to go back a bit in the next chapter. So going into chapter 4. So in chapter 4, he starts off with the Jews in Visigoth, Spain. The Visigoths were at first an Arian kingdom over a mostly Catholic population, but eventually the Visigoth kings converted to Catholicism. But shortly after that, the Moors invaded, and in his view, the Jews were kind of instrumental in the Moorish invasion and helped them out. There's some like stuff I looked up on this, and it's like kind of unclear how much the Jews helped or not in terms of like the Moors coming in. But I think the general trend does show that the Jews like probably preferred Moorish rule over Catholic rule, especially like in the beginning stages where the Moors had just recently converted to Islam. I don't know. I think there's also like some overstatements on this issue, and I'll list some of the sources that I encountered on that. But anyway, because of the invasion of Spain, there's obviously Muslims, there's Jews, there's Catholics. So during this time, the Inquisition is brought into being or whatever during the Reconquista, because there are a lot of people who are like conversos, like either Muslim or Jews, to Christianity, or just again like heretics in general. Inquisition's job is to like root out heresy among Catholics, not necessarily to like persecute Jews if they're just Jews, but if you're a converso, you technically become under like the auspices of Catholic law and the Inquisition. And he talks about there being anti-Jewish riots, and there's like a lot of mass conversions. And again, with mass conversions, some are sincere, some are not. There's the disputation of Tortosa, which occurs between a Jewish convert to Catholicism and some Jewish rabbis, and they like, it's not really like a fair, even-sided debate. It's more of like the Catholics kind of interrogating the Jews on the Talmud, but it just brings more knowledge, I guess, of the Talmud to Catholic eyes. So there's like, you know, book burnings and stuff after that. There are a number of like debates that have gone on in history kind of like this, but this one specifically was a bit more one-sided, but there are other ones that were just like more even debates. They're just like kind of an interesting thing to look at in themselves. So not much to say about that chapter. So going into chapter 5, he talks about like certain proto-Protestants like John Huss, Wycliffe, Henry VIII just was a Protestant. But he kind of describes these proto-Protestant movements as Judaizing heresies as well, by looking at more like temporal and like nationalistic rule. Like he uses Henry VIII as an example of like an English church, like an English nationalism under the guise of religion. And John Huss in Prague, he mentions John Wycliffe, who's a popular commentator on the Bible, and Jan Zalewski, who was like a more radical Hussite who led a movement or a group known as the Taborites. And basically these proto-Protestant movements were just kind of against like the church hierarchy and like the wealth of the monasteries. He calls them proto-communists, who kind of wanted to bring back like the early church, first generation of believers who kind of like shared everything. And especially the Taborites became like more and more like violent and radical. And in terms of the Jews, he kind of just says that the Jews like generally favored these groups and like may have supplied arms, or just like may have given like, I don't know, hospitality to these groups. And basically because if they're anti-Catholic Church, it was better for the Jews because the Jews would have like more freedom and just like be seen as more equal, because these proto-Protestant groups, like they saw the Catholic Church as more of an enemy than the Jews, and like even kind of respected the Jews more and like looked at the Old Testament and stuff. But I do think it is interesting that, I mean, he doesn't really even mention too much of like Jews doing stuff in this chapter. It's more just like these proto-Protestants. And at least for John Huss and John Wycliffe, like those are like very respected figures in Protestant history. So it is kind of interesting that he has to like basically say, and he like infers this later on, that like a lot of Protestantism is just kind of like this like nationalistic, Judaizing heresy essentially against Catholicism. I do think it's a bit of like blaming the Jew when there's like people just have their own ideas, and he doesn't even really say like directly like, oh, the Jews like directly caused these people. It's just he just says they are Judaizers and that Jews may have supported them, but he doesn't go so far as to say like, oh, they're like a Jewish conspiracy or anything like that. So then going into chapter 6, he goes back to Spain and talks about the converso problem. A lot of Jews convert to Christianity. Some are sincere, some are not. I mean, if you convert to Christianity, a lot more doors open up for you, and there'd be, you wouldn't have the head tax on you, as he puts it. I don't exactly know what that is. I guess it's a tax for being Jewish, which I do find a lot of similarities between like Catholic law on minorities and just like Sharia law. I'm not really making a criticism. It was just like the Middle Ages, so people had like a more, I guess, traditional like religious outlook, and like they just had to manage their countries and politics in that sense. But there's like a lot of comparisons with Sharia and Catholic law in terms of minorities, I think. And he mentioned some pretty famous people who apparently were conversos, or at least from families of conversos, like in the Catholic faith, like Teresa of Avila, Bartolomeo de las Casas, Saint John of the Cross. Also Torquemada, who was the leader of the Spanish Inquisition, was a converso, and Solomon Halevi, who he mentions in a previous chapter. So those people were all pretty like staunch Catholics and like are praised in the Catholic Church and from converso families. He also mentions Isaac of Roca Mora, I believe it's pronounced, and he was a converso, or at least from a converso family, but he actually left Spain and went to the Netherlands, where he like declared himself a Jew and basically like reverted back to Judaism and stuff. So he just is showing that there's like kind of like this two-way thing, and because there's like this kind of friction between conversos and just like the regular Catholics, because you can never really tell if a converso was going to be sincere in their beliefs or going to revert back. The conversos are called marranos in Spanish, which I guess like is somewhat similar to like swine or pig. I think the origin's kind of unknown, but there's this racial kind of animus that occurs from this, that like, oh, even if they were baptized, they're still in a Marrano family and can't really be trusted. So the Inquisition is there to like root out any Judaizing, like reversion in the converso community and stuff like that. And even like, as said previously, like if you were forced to convert, it doesn't really matter because you're still technically a Catholic after that, so you can't just revert back. So that was also a problem with conversos. At times, he says the Spanish Inquisition was a bit like too much, even for like the Catholics, and the Pope like criticized it sometimes. But they would defend themselves by saying it was a state operation, not like a Catholic operation, even though like obviously the two are interlinked. And E. Michael Jones's big thing is that he thinks forced conversion is wrong, but he also says that acceptance of forced conversion is wrong, and you should just die instead of falsely convert. Which I understand from like a Christian perspective, like you are supposed to like choose martyrdom over like renouncing your faith. But apparently, in like Maimonides and other Jewish writers of the time, they like kind of gave like, okay, you could convert as long as you're not like sincere with it, if it's in order to save your life or something. There's nothing like immoral about that. I think Muslims have the same thing too. That's like the whole taqiyya thing. I do think it's like a bit victim blaming, like honestly, like to say like, oh, like they shouldn't have converted and just accepted death. I mean, they shouldn't have been forced to convert, really. Like, I mean, I think that's pretty basic. I mean, he acknowledges that, but I just think it's a bit of victim blaming, to say the least. But I mean, whatever. It's I don't think he's really making like moral judgments too much in the book. He's more just like outlining history. And the whole racial thing, just as an aside, is a big thing for Jones. Like, he doesn't really see race in the same way as a lot of like white nationalists do. He doesn't even really believe whiteness is a thing. Just on like a different tangent, but you can see this in like his debate with Jared Taylor, and also the guys at Occidental Observer, I guess, reviewed his book, and they don't have like the greatest things to say about him. So it is like definitely a different kind of thing than like the white nationalist perspective on these matters. But anyway, I think that's it for now, and I'll continue to do this later on. Probably not gonna like one right after the other in terms of Jones. I'm just gonna like switch it around with other videos. But anyway, catch you later.